everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to introduce Eric Woodruff. And before I read his bio, we would like to give him a token of our appreciation as a B-side speaker. So thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
Throughout his 23-year career in the IT field, Eric has sought out and held a diverse range of roles, including technical manager in the public sector, senior premier field engineer at Microsoft, and security and identity architect in the Microsoft partner ecosystem. Currently, he serves as a product technical specialist at Semperis, focusing on ITDR and cloud identity resilience. Eric is a Microsoft MVP for security, recognized for his expertise in the Microsoft identity ecosystem. Outside of work, Eric supports the professional community, providing his insights and expertise at conferences, participating in the ID Pro Body of Knowledge Committee, and blogging about Entra and related cloud security topics. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Kathy. I sound much more full of myself when I hear that read out loud than when it's, online. All right, let's get going. So, yeah, the topic today is Active Directory, and it ain't going anywhere, so we might as well secure it. As Kathy mentioned, I'm Eric Woodruff. Really don't need to talk about myself anymore, but social media handles here, right? I'm Eric on identity, right? A lot of people probably heard of Krebs on security, trying to copy them. Yeah, you'll see that plastered around, but it's easy to find me, Eric on identity, right? So the agenda today, we're going to talk about why Active Directory security is important, and then securing Active Directory, right? Pretty straightforward. So, but before we get into things, we'll just set a little background with a bit of a story here, right? So I actually like hiking, and I like the Adirondacks, love the Adirondacks, but also love going up to Acadia National Park in Maine. And up here, there's Precipice Trail, and it might be hard to see, but sort of off to the right of these iron rung-looking things is basically like falling to your death sort of stuff. And at the foot of the trail, right, there's this sign here that, tells us, like, don't bring our dogs, just stay on the trail, don't hike if it's, icy or raining out or dark, wear hiking boots, right? And, if you sort of hang with me here, right, I'd say that this is really effectively like defense in depth, right? And so for those that are familiar with defense in depth, this might seem like a recap, but kind of prior to Zero Trust, right, defense in depth was a thing that we all strived for, where we had several mitigating controls, right, to make sure that whatever the data was at the center of things, right, was protected. So if one of the controls failed, right, we'd have other compensating controls. So, I look at this as, right, like, well, if I go hike in my Crocs or something up this, but it's not the middle of the night or, the middle of winter, right, you'll probably still survive the hike. So a lot of times when we talk about defense in depth, it's also described as like an onion, right? Again, you have all these layers protecting things in the middle. And I think, right, like a lot of times when you see a defense in depth model, it's like, physical security, perimeter, networking, identity and access management, and we have data right in the middle. That's the thing we're trying to protect. But you really can apply defense in depth to, anything, right, when you look at it. And so when we talk about securing Active Directory today, we'll kind of look at all these different controls we can kind of put in place, right, to protect Active Directory, right, because for a lot of organizations and enterprises, AD, right, love or hate Microsoft, love or hate Active Directory, it's there, right, and it's also something that tends to be, the vector for ransomware and data exfiltration and all these other good things, right? So it might be hard to see, but here's our little AD in the middle. So, this is marketing sort of stuff here with the new security perimeter. And I was actually going to take the new part out in a Blue Team Con talk I gave this past summer, talking about building yourself into identity practitioner. I was looking at this whole identity as a new security perimeter thing. And when you research it, you find out that the term was really coined back in 2012. Right, and it's 2024 now, so I don't know when we're going to stop saying it's the new perimeter, right? But this is the sort of reality that we live in, right? This is the only slide I sort of stole from work material, but we have identity, right? We have our everyone's remote, vendors, contractors, our MSSPs, our CSPs, all these things, right, where they're coming in remotely, both into our SaaS applications and our cloud estates. And then, right, that's usually tied to our on-prem legacy stuff, or maybe not so much legacy, right, because a lot of the stuff is here to stay, right? But identity really is a thing, right, that is the vector into, right, our networks. And you go look at any sort of news article, right, where ransomware, data exfiltration, right, some account has been breached in the majority of these cases. And also when you talk about hybrid identity, right, hybrid identity is tough. So again, this is something that a lot of enterprises, big, small, medium, sort of everywhere, right, are going to have in these sort of Microsoft ecosystem, and assuming that people here have some sort of interest or have a Microsoft estate, if you're here to listen to talk about Active Directory, right? But so we have Active Directory on-prem, and we have all of our, on-prem things, our servers, our databases, our services, all this sort of stuff. And, now we're introducing, cloud, right? And so Entra ID, which used to be Azure Active Directory or Azure AD, Microsoft renamed it this summer, right? That comes into play because we're consuming Office 365 or Microsoft 365, or we're consuming Azure, right? And we plumb these things up with Entra Connect or Entra Cloud Sync, right? And this is a thing that's really gluing the two identity systems together. And then we take all these other SaaS applications, right? And we also tack these on to Entra, usually using SAML or OpenID Connect, right, for application integration from an authentication perspective. But when you look at this, Active Directory for pretty much every organization is still authoritative, right? Microsoft still has some room to go to sort of, right, flip the switch, and as much as they want to pretend that Active Directory is dead, right, it's not going away anytime soon for anyone that really has it in the enterprise. So with AD being authoritative, right, if Active Directory is breached, right, and we again see in the news that on-prem things will be breached, and right, whether it's ransomware or exfiltration or all the above, right, and there's lots of ways to sort of move laterally from Active Directory to Entra ID. And I think this is going to get much worse before it gets better. People will argue whether, threat actors are becoming more intelligent or if they're just going after sort of the path of least resistance here, but they certainly adapt, right? And there's been cases of tenants, right? So a tenant is like the estate for Entra ID being compromised. And when you own a tenant, you basically own Office 365 and all your Azure resources. Just in the role I have and sort of seeing like the roadmap of things, I believe that, right, these sort of compromises are going to become, more frequent. That's where the threat actors are going to go, right? But when we start federating things again, right, all this other stuff is going to become compromised too. Right, you got Workday, you got Salesforce, right? Your AWSs, your GCPs that you may federate back to Entra ID for authentication, right? Well, it's pretty easy if you own Entra to move into those other estates as well, and it can look pretty bad. Right, so here's Alex Weiner. He's the VP of Identity Security at Microsoft, and just in a paper that was published last year, he was quoted talking about attacks like ransomware or the second stage, right, predicated by an identity compromise. And we end up using it in a lot of our marketing, but I think it's Mandiant also had published statistics where they were saying, like, out of all the ransomware cases they work, that 90% of them were sort of due to a breach of Active Directory prior to the ransomware incident. Right, and like I mentioned, you can see in the news. So here's, icy malware compromises Active Directory domain in less than a day. Right, the MGM breach. Now this had more of an Okta focus, but again, right, with all the MGM stuff that happened this past summer, it was an identity breach going on. Right, you could easily go fill this slide with news articles, with ransomware attacks and data exfiltration and all this good stuff. And I actually really like podcasts, and I'll say that for those that are not familiar with the ransomware files, this was a short-lived series. There's maybe 12, 13 episodes, all about organizations, right? They cover the Maersk, WannaCry situation, but they also talk to like school districts and everything. And pretty much every single one of these cases, Active Directory is popped, leading to things that happened. And it's a really good series. If you like podcasts, would suggest to check it out, right? So hopefully everyone probably already was scared, or at least understood this is the reality of things before coming into this talk, right? But just trying to reiterate why it's so critical to protect Active Directory, at least until we can get rid of it. And then we just have to worry about protecting Entra ID. Right, so let's look at securing Active Directory. So as I go through this, I mean, we could be in here for like 8 days if we wanted to really talk about, right, securing Active Directory. So some of this is going to be higher level. I'm not getting into too much of like the nuts and bolts of necessarily everything. A lot of the data that we're going to look at, though, is based on sort of common things that we see with attacks on organizations, right? So we have a breach preparedness and response team. We also analyze what other, organizations like SpectraOp and Trimark, and you could just keep rattling off names, right, are also seeing, as well as we also provide incident response, right? So we go in because an organization's been compromised. And these are the things that we tend to see, right, when Active Directory is breached, and how we can defend against this. So, our first thing here is implementing strong identity processes. Now, this is like a huge bag that this can really mean, but what we're really talking about is identity governance and administration, right? And that, again, can be something that's very simple, or it can become very complex, right? And it all sort of depends on several different factors in an organization. It's one of the areas where I'd say for the IT pros and the InfoSec people that are managing and defending Active Directory, though, it's where you really have to put your business hat on, whether you like it or not, right? Because this boils down to not having it where employees leave or fired or quit or retired and their accounts stay active. Again, in the past week or so, there was some case where there was an employee that had left an organization and his credentials were found on the internet and they were still active in that organization. The threat actor got into Salesforce and then moved into some Salesforce integration with their DocuSign. And we see a lot in the news lately that DocuSign is like one of the favorite things for phishing, right? Because you get that email that's like, here's your huge raise, just click on this link, right? But I mean, those are the situations we really want to avoid, right? People with privilege leaving an organization and their accounts still being active. But I think it also points out the reality that, right, privilege isn't just your domain administrators these days. There's a lot of people that have access to business systems that, if we go back to that new identity, perimeter, right, they're much more exposed than they used to be because we had our firewalls and, aside from maybe a BES server or something, like, right, not much left sort of the corporate perimeter. But now that we have it's like a sieve and all this stuff is getting out and getting in and ways to access data, right, everything, not just our IT systems, are much more susceptible. So getting a bit more technical here, the next thing we want to do is secure Active Directory Forest trusts. Not every organization is going to have trusts, but if you've gone through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, or just some organizations have a legacy of different trusts. Right? There's two things that we really want to focus on, which is using selective authentication. Right? And so selective authentication, and so I'll step back and say, for those less familiar with Active Directory, the trust is sort of like, or the forest is the security boundary. Right? And if we have multiple forests, Forest A, Forest B, we can create a trust between them so people can sort of authenticate between the two different forests, right? There's a web server, file server in the other forest, and you want to give me access to it, well, we can create a trust, and then I can effectively go in and access that without needing an account in that Active Directory forest, right? So selective authentication, while it is more difficult to maintain, basically would say like, hey, Eric is only allowed to actually authenticate and gain access to, file server 1. I can't get into file server 2 or 3 or 4. Right? So if you have forest trust, and especially in scenarios where some organizations may have like the trusted forest that, is used for business critical things, and then the like dumpster forest for, all the business things, right? You may want to look at, in particular, sort of limiting the access into that business critical forest. And the other thing here is, ensuring that we have SID filtering active across these forest trusts, because, so again, without getting into the weeds too much, basically when you go through domain migrations, right, so each user object has a unique SID, with like an identifier for who you are, right? And when you go through a migration, there's the SID history that effectively keeps a list of all your prior SIDs from other domains, and you can sort of use this as a shortcut when you authenticate to, services where you don't need to go re-ACL stuff, right? Because instead of, we migrate from domain A or forest A to forest B, right? And in B, we can simply say like, hey, Eric used to be like, this guy over in forest A, instead of having to reset permissions on services, right? And so the problem that you can have here is if someone is malicious, right, between trusts, they can basically copy SIDs from other users, put them in their SID history, and basically abuse this to impersonate other users within Active Directory. But again, it's really only something that's going to happen if you have multiple forests with trusts. So a big one here is Kerberos, right? So there was actually a talk earlier from Q, right, about NTLM, and we want people to use Kerberos, but there's still issues that can occur with Kerberos. Now, working in the sort of software industry around securing Active Directory, a lot of customers ask, right, about golden ticket attacks, right? And we want to make sure we detect golden ticket attacks. But we can also just try to prevent golden ticket attacks from occurring, because a golden ticket attack can only happen if we actually have access to the KRB TGT account, right? And so this is like a special account in Active Directory that is basically used for minting all other tickets in AD, right? But the only way you can get that is if you have access to a domain controller, so you already have domain admin, or you have right system or something else on that DC to get access to this. So, and kind of what led up to wanting to give talks like this is like, well, instead of investing all right time and money, and let's go do AI and machine learning things to, try to look for golden ticket attacks, it's like, well, why don't we just work on like not breaching our domain controllers, and then we can't have golden ticket attacks happen, right? So one of the things though is wanting to rotate that password on a biannual, so twice a year basis. Microsoft recommends this, as well as STIG, but also if you have domain admins that leave the organization, right, in sort of this zero trust way that we work these days, would also recommend rotating the KRB TGT account password, if someone with privilege in Active Directory leaves. So also we want to eliminate unconstrained delegation. So unconstrained delegation, so delegation is a mechanism in Active Directory that allows services to impersonate users, right? An unconstrained delegation effectively would allow a service to impersonate anyone. Again, right, that could be a domain admin. And many times these services are not running on privileged systems, right? It could be like a web server. And scenarios that you may run into where organizations can sort of fall into these patterns of using unconstrained delegation is service is supposed to impersonate users, something doesn't work, right? All the knobs and dials are just turned to loosen things, right? Until something starts working, you're like troubleshooting done, right? Have a nice day, and you're off to whatever the next IT fire is, right? So really looking in Active Directory for areas where Kerberos delegation is configured in an unconstrained model, and trying to figure out really like what do we want to do here, and tightening that up. And then also the other thing that people really love to ask if we can detect are things like Kerberos-ting, right? So Kerberos-ting is this thing where if you have service accounts that are user objects, right? So you have, user, backup, right? And it's just a user account that's called backup, and it has a service principal name set on it, right? And so a service principal name, SPN, is effectively used to sort of, mark what accounts have services associated with an Active Directory, but just without getting into like all the ways that Kerberos works, effectively, if a service account has an SPN set on it, you can basically get the password hash for that service account relatively easy, right? And then you can crack it offline, and then you know the clear text password for whatever that account is, right? So I have my account backup, and I've set my password to password 1234 bang, which someone could probably guess anyways, right? But we're going to take the hash and try to crack that offline and then replay it. So again, Kerberos-ting though becomes an issue if that service is backup and we gave our backup software like domain admin because the vendor said we need it, or we couldn't figure out why something was working or not working, right? And now using tools out there like Mimikatz or Rubus, you can go out and basically easily request service accounts that have SPNs and get that hash and go crack it offline. But now you may say we have EDRs and everything that are probably going to detect this stuff, right? But I don't know. You don't necessarily want to leave this stuff up to chance based on the criticality of Active Directory. So number 4 here is deterring lateral movement, right? And this is not just AD related, but also to your sort of, client estate, right? So limiting local administrator group membership, which I know is very difficult for organizations, right? Because everyone wants to have local admins so they can, do local admin things. You may find that a PAM solution, right, that can give just-in-time access will work good enough if, you have the sort of capital available to, implement something like that. But at least implement laps on all your servers and clients. So I may or may not have worked at a place where we had a very delegated, distributed IT model because it was the public sector role. And they were not using laps, so every client had the same password set locally for administrator, right? And someone got some ransomware I think it was ransomware, on one of their devices, right? And now all of a sudden, everyone's client device is, becoming encrypted, right? And LAPS, which basically manages a local administrator password for you and right, keeps them unique and rotates them on a monthly basis, will protect us from that. So we're doing on time. So we also want to secure privileged users and groups, and some of this, it kind of builds up, right? Because we're already talking about securing Kerberos, but with our privileged users and groups, right, we want to limit privileged service accounts. So again, you may find in particular things like backup software, right, may at one time have needed domain administrator, and as some of these platforms have evolved, they don't need it anymore, right? So it's good to sort of keep up with your vendors and see if hey, right, does this need domain admin or not? Or do we necessarily need to give it domain admin? In some scenarios, it's so that we can do, object level restores in Active Directory. But these days with the recycling bin and AD, there's native ways that Microsoft provides the ability to do restores. And this one we also see abused a lot is the admin SD holder object. So admin SD holder is effectively this object that's used for containing the permissions, right, the access control list that is applied to privileged users, protected users in Active Directory. Again, this includes your domain admins. And, it's always a mystery why we see these things, but admin SD holder permissions will be changed to say right, the help desk or service desk group has access to reset passwords. Applied to admin SD holder, and now effectively you've given your entire help desk, right, indirect domain admin because their account just needs to be breached, right, and they can reset a domain admin's password, and then they're sort of off to the races. So yeah, the admin SD holder object is something we see a lot with all sorts of weird things. You see domain users, right, which is basically everyone will have permissions over this. And how this functions is once an hour, there's a process that sort of looks at the permissions that are set in an admin SD holder, and it restamps them on, you know, your protected users, like your domain admin. So if you've ever tried to change something like an ACL, right, the permissions on a domain admin or the group, and then wondered why they get reverted, it's admin SD holder kind of coming to the rescue. So again, this one is a bit broad, but it's really looking at, and we'll kind of break this down, right, defining tier 0, right? So if you've been around the block for a while in the Microsoft ecosystem, you've probably seen this sort of model, right? Tier 0, tier 1, tier 2. So Microsoft has actually replaced this with the enterprise access model, but this still works well when we're talking about Active Directory security, right? And effectively, if we look at this, right, tier 0, the top tier, may be a little hard to see in the back. All right, you have your domain admins, your privileged access workstations, and your domain controllers, and you always want to stay within the same tier. But tier 0 really isn't just this these days, right? Because we get some fancy animation going here. We have Active Directory Federation services, or things like Active Directory Certificate services, right, that are really in the mix. And a lot of organizations don't consider these things to be tier 0. Right, again, Entra Connect or Entra Cloud Sync, or the Okta agent, right? So if you're an Okta shop, the Okta agent also out of the box installs, wants privileges, right, for plumbing Active Directory up to Okta, right? So that's tier 0, and we'll grow this a little more, right? And we talk about backups. Again, we'll see a lot of times that the way organizations have their backups configured, effectively, your backup administrators are also indirect domain admins. And there's also the management plane, right? So for our cloud services, but this may also be with other virtualization platforms, where the management plane is effectively tier 0. Now, we're going to get into a demo in a second. When I got some feedback on this talk before, people had wanted more things, so now we'll do a demo here in a second. As we talk about protecting tier 0, right? So we want to define it, and then we want to protect it. Before we get into the demo, though, one of the things is mapping our attack paths, right? And so you may see in like XDR platforms that they have like attack paths, you know, as maps, right? So if there's an incident, it will sort of show you graphically what's happened, right? But what we want to do is sort of get ahead of the ball and actually like map our attack paths right before an incident, right? And so this is using something like Bloodhound, right, is the most popular thing. Right, some organizations get scared of Bloodhound, so there's also Plumhound and Goodhound and Bluehound. You know, I'll corporate shill that we make something for us. Druid, that is also similar. That is free. I'm only going to say free things here. And there's also Avalanche as well, which will help map attack paths, right? Because if we step back and look at this like admin SD holder thing, right, while you can write sort of detection rules, right, in systems to say, hey, go like audit for all these things in Active Directory. Many times you'll also find weird things that were set for, you know, business reasons. And there's only logic, right, that you're going to necessarily know, or you may not know because the person that said it is long gone, but you still understand enough of the context, right, where there's security aspects to really understanding what permissions look like in Active Directory that you sort of have to pick apart, right? And many times using things like Bloodhound, Avalanche, or Forest Druid, right, will give you a visualization and let you sort of start to pick apart, right, like where do we actually really need to create those choke points? I think we're not supposed to call it that anymore, right, to cut off access to domain administrator. So we also want to follow the clean source principle. Again, so, you know, if we look at this, right, and I pretty much already, you know, mentioned here, we really want to make sure that we're using privileged access workstations and we're following the clean source principle, which is where the device that we're accessing things from as domain administrator is in that same tier, right? I don't want to run over to it, but if you look at the middle tier here, right, tier 1, you'll find a lot of organizations where it's tier 1 or tier 2 laptops, desktops, whatnot, right, that people are doing domain admin things from. Well, if your credentials are used local to that system, it can be very easy for, right, an attacker, red team, whatnot, to pick those creds up, right, and move into Active Directory. Right, and so as I mentioned here, we're going to include the management plane, right, and before our demo here, just going to walk through, see we're doing on time, right, this attack scenario here. So, here we have a user, right, that works in our operations center, and this is sort of like real world scenarios. And again, what we're going to talk about here is something that Mandiant's seen used in the wild, so this isn't like theory, right? So Operations Center, access to the Azure portal, and they have access to subscriptions, right? Subscriptions are sort of buckets of stuff in Azure. And because, right, we don't want people to be bothered off hours, they're given access to do things against VMs that we have running out in Azure. So they're given like access like virtual machine contributor and reader roles, right? And this allows them to do things like start and stop VMs and, basic things. They can't log into them, right, unless you've given them permissions. So it's really just like management sort of functionality, right? Instead of asking someone to go in the data center and, hold the button down until the power is shut off and turn it back on, it's like that virtually. And then we have a domain controller, though, out here running, right, that is in this sort of bucket, and they have a run command function available to them, right? And run command can effectively be used to, let me change my display here, do whatever you want on a domain controller if you have access. So signed in here is Alex Wilbur, which this user account only has virtual machine contributor and reader, right? And we have a domain controller here, right? And so on our domain controller, now you can also use Azure CLI or PowerShell or whatnot. I'm just using the GUI here because it's easy, right? We're going to go down and we are going to find run command. And we're just going to choose to run a PowerShell script. And now actually before we do this, we'll just hop over to our domain controller, right? And if we look right here, we're just going to get members of domain admin, and we can see that we just have one domain admin, right? So there's no tricks up my sleeves. And we are just going to run something super simple, right? You can get more complex than this, but we're just going to create a user, and then we're just going to add the user to domain admins. And the agent, which you need on your domain controllers, well, the agent which you need on any Windows virtual machine in Azure for it to function out there, right, runs under the system context. So local to the DC, right, it basically can do whatever system can do. So we'll run this. And usually it takes a second here. Oh, we will let this run, and I'll just go back to the slides because, it either takes like 5 seconds, but then when you're wanting to demo it, it takes like, 12 minutes. So we'll let that keep running. Oh, command completed successfully here. So, right, so here we go, right? We have a new domain admin. And again, whatever you want to do, right? You don't have to go add a new user. You could do all sorts of things here, but it's just that simple. Now, as far as these management plane attacks go, I'll actually bring up here. Just give me a second to switch things back. So I'll show myself for both that and also Azure Arc, right? So Arc is becoming a new thing where it's to extend, right, sort of the management from Azure into other cloud providers or on-prem. The Arc agent, you can basically do similar things, and Microsoft is really pushing using Arc. So this week, though, with Windows Server 2025 coming out, there's the Windows Server Summit 2024. And I have a session that's protecting Active Directory from management plane attacks. So there are ways to architect things from a RBAC perspective in the cloud, right, to protect yourself from these. So you can go to aka.ms Windows Server Summit 2024 and look for that. And also, I will have all these slides available that you can get that link later from as well. But it's going to be Tuesday evening, and it's recorded, so you can watch it whenever you want. All right. So also hardening our domain controllers, right? This is one that it can be a very large bucket. But in particular, we want to do things like disable unnecessary services, right? So one of the attacks in the past, maybe 4 or 5 years, was Print Nightmare, right? And this was a remote code vulnerability, right? RCE execution against print spooler service, and it gave people a path onto domain controllers, right? And so this is even one of those things where I think when we talk about like XDR and all these fancy detections, right? You always have these edge cases of 0-day things that we're not necessarily going to detect, or, right, we talk a lot about, things like deception and all this for, stealing password hashes and like, right, replaying them. But if it's a 0-day, right, a lot of our systems are going to have no idea that these sort of things exist, right? But if we limit the surface area on our DCs, again, right, print spooler's not running. It's as simple as that. Our domain controller would not be susceptible to, the Print Nightmare attack. And print spooler service historically has had a lot of sort of vulnerabilities over the past decade or so. But also remove unnecessary roles, right? So even if we want to run Active Directory certificate services, things like that, right? Don't run it on your DC. As much as you want to, don't run Entra-Connect on your domain controller, right? Try to segment these things out. And again, remove unnecessary agents. So, in other scenarios we may see, right, like you have some sort of, where you're using, physical iron, like agents that are used for management and inventory type purposes, right? And again, if those agents have the ability to run things on your domain controllers, right, whoever manages your, HP, I forget what HP calls it now, right, the onboard administrator sort of collective thing, right, they also are likely domain admins, whether you know it or not. And also apply hardening policies, right? So this is going to get you pretty far from tightening the security down on your DCs. Where I think this is important is, right, a sort of greenfield new install of Active Directory is going to be relatively secure out of the box. But for organizations that have had AD around for a good while, right, there's a lot of sprawl on group policies, and those are typically used, right, for setting the security sort of model on our domain controllers. There's both the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit, which is free, and there's also, the other big one is the Center for Internet Security CIS controls. That one, you do have to pay money unless you, there's a PDF that's free, unless you want to translate that, or if you Google it, you can find other people that have sort of done that for you. But I know PubSec, actually, there's a sort of relationship with CIS where you can get access to CIS benchmarks and other things that will allow you to apply other group policies to your DCs for free as well, right? And I'll say within the Security Compliance Toolkit that Microsoft publishes, there's something called the Policy Analyzer, right? So a lot of times it feels big and scary to say, let's just go let this group policy rip and hope for the best. So if you want to see, right, where you currently stand versus, where you'd like to be, the Policy Analyzer just basically looks at, where you want to be. You import a policy for what you're hoping to get to. You import your current policies, and it will effectively, show you a diff between them. And you can sort of move through it and see what each, group policy setting would do, right? So you can kind of build an understanding of where you currently stand and where you want to go, and right. There was something else. Oh, there's also Hardening Kitty is another tool that exists out there for securing Windows estate, and that can include your domain controllers, and that's also sort of open source stuff. Right, but we still want to monitor for unusual activity, right? And so this is getting into the whole ITDR thing. And again, I'm not going to make any sort of recommendations on things because, I'm not here to sort of shill stuff, but right, when you see XDR, and I think in one of the sessions earlier, right, the conversation starts to come up around like, right, detecting things. And you can write rules in SIMs, and I've talked to people who write rules to detect stuff, right, because you're really just looking at patterns. But some of this stuff can become very difficult to detect. Like if you're trying to look for password spray attacks, right, and these days threat actors will sort of go like a low and slow model that, right, they try to stay below certain thresholds. You know, this was kind of hot when we had user behavior analytics or and whatnot, right? And it sort of morphed into identity threat detection and response. But if you are a Microsoft customer, this is going to be like Defender for Identity, right? CrowdStrike has identity protection within it. SentinelOne, right? They've all got it. Most of the XDR companies have bought an ITDR company and just sort of integrated their identity protection into their platforms. But you know, it kind of leads into that. If you have to recover Active Directory, right, you're talking like weeks of time. So when, you know, you talk to a lot of organizations, and if they even have ever attempted to restore Active Directory, like a forest, right? So you've been ransomwared. You need to stand up AD, because if AD isn't stood up, all your other apps that you're trying to restore won't work, right? And the actual process to restore a forest is not straightforward, and it's time consuming, right? And you'll talk to people who are like, well, we've got it, you know, sort of in our DR, BC plans. But then you ask them, right, like, have they actually gone through the process? And have they actually measured how long it takes? And also, right, if it's like a shop where you're like the person that does everything, or you have a few people that are doing everything right, if you only are able to give like 10% of your time to restoring Active Directory, right, have you pretended that's what it's really like? Because if you just sit down and say, we're just going to spend the next 2 days restoring AD and everyone leave us alone while we're locked in a conference room, right, that's not what the reality of things are going to look like if you've actually been, you know, ransomed. So I just want to leave you with, I think this is interesting here. So this is, again, it's probably hard to see at the top. It's from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report from 2023. And there's a lot on this slide, and you don't really need to focus on it, but in this, right, this is basically based off of Microsoft's data from their own IR team, which was previously DART. Now I think it's just Microsoft Incident Response. Right, and so this year, though, they have this return on mitigation that they've defined, where they're basically trying to help organizations understand, right, what mitigating factors will have a higher, like, sort of return on their investment, right? So you measuring, like, what things can you do to secure, right, identity or secure your systems that are going to help better protect you. And they break this up, and again, in the upper right here, there's blue, which is a higher return on mitigation, a purple, which is a medium return on mitigation, and a low, or a sort of pale green, that's a low return on mitigation, right? And again, you know, not expecting people to be able to read all this, because I probably couldn't even read it. But everything we've talked about today, what I wanted to highlight, that everything's popping up with red around it, are all really related to Active Directory. And right, everything kind of that we've high level covered here all falls into those higher return on mitigation buckets, right? So for a lot of organizations, it can be a challenge at times to sort of, right, prioritize money, time, all those things into securing AD. And I like to look at this as a way of, right, helping try to justify to the organization from a business aspect, right, why we need to invest in these things. And you know, the report dives deeper into all this sort of stuff. They just have this chart that's a bit high level. So, and with that, any questions? Actually, before questions, I'll say, so on this sl.entra.ms, I bought the domain before Microsoft could get it, /secure AD. I'm going to have the slides available, as well as some of the other things I talked about, like links to all the GitHubs or whatnot for those. So, all right, now I'll take questions, and I think, yeah.
How much onus does Microsoft have on setting secure defaults, by default? There's things like when machine quotas for user data can change the domain, SMB setting by default on endpoints, and things like that. How much do you think they play a part in setting secure defaults for people who are less experienced and want to set these things up?
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. So, I mean, I've heard that with Server 2025, they're supposedly going to take a harder stance in having a lot of, I think, the settings for like SMB and LDAP signing and whatnot, sort of like enabled by default. Where it's a problem for a lot of orgs, right, is that if your domain is old, right, you bring those newer DCs in, but then they get whatever your existing group policies are that are probably loosening things up. I mean, it's a tricky question. There's definitely areas where, right, I think they historically would lean more towards usability over security. I think they're trying to make things better, but the reality is, right, I mean, these days, a lot of startups, I mean, we're an Active Directory company. We don't have Active Directory because we're a startup, right? So you're seeing newer companies not necessarily needing to stand up AD, but it's the older estates, right? And those ones, you're sort of bringing all the crap forward. So I know that's kind of like a non-answer answer, right? I consulted it for a while, so I'll give you the, like, it depends. But other questions? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on disabling NTLM for some of the stuff?
Oh, I mean, I think if you can, I think it's great, right? I mean, again, the talk this morning showing how easy it is to sort of, you know, poke around with NTLM and get hashes and try to go after organizations. Right, but it's an it depends thing, right? If you have some old system that's running your, you know, medical devices or your CNC machines or whatnot, right? And they're running like Server 2000, right? I mean, there's other things you can do, right? And you can get into more complex scenarios with like, you know, like authentication silos and whatnot in Active Directory, but those things aren't necessarily, you know, easy. And I would say so authentication silos, and there's a way to sort of set policies to limit who can sort of authenticate to what, right? And you could sort of set that on your domain admins, but as it goes, it's not like something in a GUI to sort of do this stuff. So, but again, sort of non-answer answer, but yeah. Other questions? How about far back and then, yeah.
So it sounds like you think that Active Directory will eventually go away. I'm curious, I don't have a lot of experience with Entra. If it does go away, will Entra be able to take the place for like group policies that are helping to manage laptops and things like that? Is it pretty much Active Directory in the cloud?
Yeah and no. So I mean, for your servers, which you know, the big thing is wanting like group policy out there. So Entra is not Active Directory in the cloud, right? It is a completely different architecture. I think there's gaps, right? A lot of people like know and love group policy for applying, right? Like hardening our servers or managing our servers, right? In some shops, if you had like SCCM, there's, well, sort of ways to move off that. You know, I know that there's like desired state config, which kind of is and is not. I've been more removed from the group policy piece of things. I do think eventually, you know, AD will and will not go away for some orgs, right? It kind of is in conjunction with if people are doing things where we're moving apps to like, you know, Kubernetes, if you can do that, and other like, you know, serverless functions or moving to Linux or, and my mind's kind of blanking on what the roadmap is for like server management, because I know a lot of people are like, give us Windows Server, you know, management in Intune, and they're like, nope, because like Intune's client. But they really haven't still definitively kind of said like, well, what is like the strong answer there? So. Yeah, you know, actually, I think because I think in Arc you can set policies or and things like that, right? So that might be another path. But yeah, and I think you had a question.
What's your thoughts on Paul between the tier 0 network, access tier 0?
Oh, like Paul, like privileged access workstations? Yeah, I absolutely am for privileged access workstations, right? So that goes back to, right, this picture here, right? And wanting to use that PAW. Now, I know PAWs can be difficult. When I worked in my public sector job, I said we're going to do PAWs, and everyone that worked for me hated me. because we were doing this. But then when I left, and actually we had, well, I say we, my former we had like a red team come in, and like Active Directory was owned in like 10 minutes. And then they're like, oh, like maybe we should do pause, right? You know, I'm plugging it tricky because, you know, currently if you look at other things like bastions and jump boxes, the problem with them is if you're still entering, right, the credentials on the lower tier system, right, there's many ways that they can still be sort of captured from that device, right, and still used. You know, I know if you're a big believer in PAM, right, PAM will sort of argue against pause. It's one of those things that can become like a sort of heated debate about whether you need pause. It depends on how much of a PAM lover you are, and they all kind of have their pros and cons. Having been regimented on, you know, drinking a lot of the Microsoft Kool-Aid for a while, I was like trained on PAW and the clean source principle to sort of avoid some of the PAM things. So get a bit rambly, but you know. Oh yeah. No, I think that there's also a lot of potential within that. But I would also go back to, right, the thing that you'll see some organizations is they'll deploy like CyberArk or Beyond Trust or whatnot, which I have no issue with, but then that thing won't be like in tier 0, right? They'll want to deploy it in a way where components of it are outside of that sort of zone. And like now, right, in a way, you've actually just sort of increased your attack surface. So, but other questions, comments? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is like, you know, the focus on, if I got this right, like how much work would you do in AD to protect Entra? And on the flip, how much work would you do in Entra to protect, you know, Active Directory? So I'll say there's a lot more attack paths from Active Directory into Entra. There's a lot of it depends on how authentication is configured, whether using password hash sync or pass-through authentication. There's a lot of known documented ways. In particular, I'd say if you don't follow Dr. Azure AD on X and those things, he's done a ton of research on lateral movement from Active Directory to Entra. The paths are less from Entra into Active Directory, right? So there are some ways that kind of came out in the past year to abuse Cloud Kerberos Trust, which is used for Windows Hello for Business in a hybrid identity scenario. Well, it is recommended to not synchronize like domain admins out to Entra ID. Other things like self-service password reset by default, unless you've mucked with admin SD holder, won't actually be able to reset a domain admin's password from the cloud. You'll get an error, it will fail, right? Because Entra Connect won't actually have permissions over the DA objects. So I would say, I guess maybe to sort of actually give you an answer, I would spend more time focusing on protecting your AD estate, and really like, and that can be just as much as making sure that you treat your Entra Connect servers as tier 0. And you see a lot of orgs where it will be like a server admin account that you'll use to manage them, right? And they have a lot of credentials in both identity systems, and they hold special roles that users can't usually get access to. But if you get on the box, right, you can basically get the tokens and the hashes and everything to act within those. So that answers your question. Yeah. Any other? Oh, is there? Oh yeah, sorry, the camera was blocking. Yeah.
No worries. Just a quick question. Do you think AD is gonna ever die?
I mean, I actually like cloud identity, so I hope so. I mean, I think eventually, right, like, it's like the mainframe, right? I worked at a place, again, my public sector job. When I was hired in 2005, it was like, this is the year we're getting rid of the mainframe. And I just talked to one of my buddies that still works there, and last year we finally got rid of the mainframe there. You know, I think it's going to depend on a per organization basis, right? And for those that are Microsoft customers and interact with Microsoft people, they will act like Active Directory is dead, right? But No, I think the reality is that if you have a large investment in it, that it's going to take a time because there's still gaps, right? Like Microsoft will tell you, go cloud only, and you're like, okay, well, how do I convert users to cloud only on a per user basis? And they're like, well, I don't know, it doesn't exist yet. Or you're like, well, how do I make Entra ID authoritative, right? And they're like, well, I don't know, right? It doesn't exist yet. So I think once we see some of these things exist, that maybe it will make that path forward clearer. But sorry, it's a bit soapboxy answer. But anything? Any other questions? All right, cool. Well, I appreciate everyone's time. I hope you got something good out of this. And and if you have any questions, again, I'll leave my socials up here. Just feel free to reach out to me. And thank you, folks.